David Cronenberg is usually thought of as being one of the greatest and most distinctive genre directors of all time, and I personally have always been a massive fan of his work. Like a lot of people, I'm getting pretty pumped for his latest new body horror epic Crimes of the Future, which will be dropping shortly, so what better time to take a look back at David Cronenberg's first ever full-length colour film, 1970's Crimes of the Future. Now, my understanding is that the 2022 film isn't a remake or a reboot of Cronenberg's earlier film, but more just something totally different that just happens to have the same title. I'm guessing that it's probably going to touch on at least some of the same kind of ideas, because Cronenberg has always been somebody who works out his own personal fears and obsessions and neuroses in his various films. And you've got your body horror, you've got your perverse sexuality, and you've got the kind of dehumanising effects of technology. Weirdly, we haven't had any great David Cronenberg films in the last 10 to 15 years or so. Instead, that gap has kind of been filled by his son, Brandon Cronenberg, whose films Antiviral and Possessor both played out like the very best of his father's work. But now, finally, the king has returned. David Cronenberg is back, baby. But let's take it back to 1970 and the start of a new decade where Mr. D. Cronenberg would make his first ever film in colour, which was, of course, Crimes of the Future. I don't know if it's really worth telling you what it's about, just because it's a film that's not really about anything. It's more of this strange vibe, a kind of dour mood piece about this cold, sparse future that's populated by a bunch of strange, emotionless weirdos who are all wrapped up in their own strange obsessions, wandering about in a kind of drugged out hippie trance, whilst David Cronenberg plays with some surreal sound design and occasional snatches of voiceover in order to explain kind of strange high concept science fiction ideas. It's one of those films where you can watch the whole thing, and if you don't read anything about the plot beforehand, you probably won't have a fucking clue what's going on. Equally, you could read the plot beforehand and be amazed by the fact that any synopsis that you read basically has got nothing to do with what you actually see on screen. Because it's not really a narrative film in any sense. It's this very experimental thing that's happy just being what it is and not really explaining itself. Now, first things first, it's just over an hour long, so maybe you might not think it counts as a proper feature-length debut. That's really more to do with what kind of a film Crimes of the Future is, which is something that's very abstract and experimental. It's not the kind of film that would ever appeal to any kind of a commercial audience, in just how sort of unique and weird and perverse a lot of it is. It's not a film that would ever be able to survive any kind of a test audience screening without studios saying, just take all that weird shit out. So it's kind of fascinating just how uncompromisingly personal the whole thing is. It's a film that does raise a lot of questions, but almost none of those questions have got anything to do with the actual ideas in the film itself. If you absolutely had to, I'm sure you could sit down and deconstruct the whole meaning and symbolism behind Crimes of the Future. It's the sort of film that you could easily cook up a pretty pretentious thesis about, but I don't really think that's fair to what Crimes of the Future actually is. I think that gives it too much credit as a film that's got any kind of a greater didactic message to impart, instead of just being an exercise in strange ideas and deliberately unconventional filmmaking. The biggest question that you have to ask, if you're coming to Crimes of the Future as a David Cronenberg fan, is how can you reconcile somebody who's made so many amazing, thought-provoking, visceral and intense films like I personally think David Cronenberg has, with the guy who made Crimes of the Future? Crimes of the Future totally doesn't work as a film in the traditional sense. It's no fun to sit through, and it's got zero interest in actually telling any kind of a story or making us feel anything, and that's really quite a difficult thing to get past. But that's not to say that there's nothing in Crimes of the Future to recommend it. It's just a case that you need to be really braced for what it is that you're going to get going in. To be honest, I think if you showed somebody Crimes of the Future blind without telling them anything about it or who directed it, I really doubt that anybody who isn't putting this film in the context of being a David Cronenberg film would ever manage to get through the whole thing. So the question is, if you've got to make so many concessions to the film itself for what it is, then is it really worth the time and effort? Is there actually anything in Crimes of the Future that makes it worth watching for anybody other than hardcore David Cronenberg fans who might think that it's sort of interesting just as a piece of history? Not really, no. But if you are a David Cronenberg fan, then there's probably some joy to be had here. Even if it's just thinking that, wow, there was a time when David Cronenberg was making films like this. So probably the most positive thing you can say about Crimes of the Future is that it's a film that even to the hardened Cronenberg fan has still got things in it that can make you say, what the fuck am I watching? But then, to be fair, you could also say the same thing about Two Girls, One Cup. Maybe Crimes of the Future was the Two Girls, One Cup of its day. But beyond just being weird as fuck in places, I think that there are bits of it, and it's a very episodic film as a whole, there's definitely bits of it that sort of work as this strange kind of hypnotic fever dream, a glimpse into this mightily fucked up subconscious mind. But then, there's things in it that you'd have trouble knowing how to justify, but then there's no attempts made at all to justify them, which means that you just accept that you're in a world where all kind of logic and reason is out the window. And that can be pretty interesting when it's done right, because you truly never know what you're going to get next. And in the hands of David Cronenberg, you can bet that it's going to be some really weird shit. And then you've got the voiceover itself, which is this fascinating jumble of odd ideas and ambitious science fiction world building that often seems to have absolutely nothing to do with what's going on screen. The voiceover is almost more like this strange evocative soundtrack score, where the words are just a mix of cool sounding syllables that are all just there to sound nice, like totally meaningless abstract poetry. It kind of adds another dimension to what we're seeing, and makes the whole world of this film seem bigger than it realistically is, but as a means of actually conveying any kind of plot, it never really rises to the occasion. It's more that it's there to try and kind of plaster over the joins in the kind of random experimental scenes of strange people doing strange things in absolute silence, and to be honest, the voiceover is often a lot better and more interesting than what we're actually seeing unfold. In fact, there was a critic by the name of Robin Wood who famously said that if you switched off the sound in Crimes of the Future, large stretches of it just end up looking like gay fetish porn, which is one of those things that it's kind of hard not to think about once it's in your mind. But the ideas that get thrown up in the voiceover are these intriguing little earworms that kind of get into your brain and make you think, and you kind of project a more interesting story onto these cold, lifeless scenes of people wandering about in a daze. In fact, the way that the whole thing comes across with its quiet, breathy narration, followed by just long stretches of silence and bizarre noises sort of fading in and out of each other, is almost like this kind of weird David Cronenberg themed ASMR, and I think it's hard to watch Crimes of the Future and not feel very sleepy.
Chomkin suggests that there must evolve a novel sexuality for a new species of man.
You've got this fading in and out of this low-toned voiceover, as well as the fact that the scenes play out in very long but totally irrational ways, where it's kind of impossible to know what's happening, what's going to happen next, or why any of it's happening or why you should care, and that makes it kind of hard to invest much energy into concentrating on any of it. But there is for sure something that's strange and hypnotic about the occasional lucid moments that bubble up amidst the sea of semi-ironic gibberish that you get in the voiceover, that seem to probe your subconscious mind with half ideas and odd oblique references to a much bigger, stranger sci-fi world that stop it from being just boring, nonsensical horseshit. In fact, it almost manages to feel like this strange, disturbing psychosexual dream where there's absolutely zero logic to it, and that things happen that you'd have trouble imagining anyone would ever actually want to put on screen, which kind of helps to make it all feel like we're looking directly into the mind of the person that made it. Because like all the best films, Crimes of the Future is an incredibly quirky but deeply personal film, but it's also impenetrable and kind of hard to warm to in any way, just like David Cronenberg himself. So the real question is there actually any point in watching the original Crimes of the Future before going to see the new one? Well, I think it's safe to say that the 2022 film is going to be almost completely its own thing. But that said, there are probably some things that you could pick out of the original, little seeds of ideas that you could expand upon and develop to make an interesting but completely different story. Because Crimes of the Future is so abstract and so uninterested in actually telling a story, that even if David Cronenberg had decided to pick out little random half-formed ideas from 1970s Crimes of the Future and use them for his new film, then because of how little explored those ideas actually were originally, it wouldn't feel like a director who's just run out of ideas and is just rehashing their old stuff. The new Crimes of the Future won't suffer from being just another version of an old film, and it will succeed or fail completely on its own merits. But the original Crimes of the Future is a reminder of a stranger time, when people with mad, twisted ideas were coming to filmmaking and making stuff that the previous generation wouldn't even have thought of as being possible. There's elements of shock to Crimes of the Future for sure, but it's also not a film that sets out just to get a cheap and easy reaction from its audience. It's more of this strange, artsy enigma, the dream of this visionary young filmmaker eager to start telling his own unique stories. The one thing that you can say is that it isn't just an early kind of rough around the edges film that's made by somebody who's still learning their stuff. It's actually a very confidently made film, and the one thing that it shows is that David Cronenberg's mind has always been full of totally unique and potent ideas, able to go to places others wouldn't even think of going. Unfortunately, it's got none of the deep thematic resonance that David Cronenberg's later stuff would have, and just generally, though experimental stuff can be interesting, I think David Cronenberg is capable of being so much more than just a guy mucking about putting weird sounds and strange voiceovers over pretty empty scenes of odd things happening very slowly. And hopefully, that's something that we're going to be seeing very shortly when the new Crimes of the Future drops, because at the very least, you should be able to see just how far David Cronenberg has come in the last 50 years when you finally get a chance to compare just how different his two Crimes of the Futures are. And I, for one, can't wait.